Over the weekend, I tuned into the Magic the Gathering Pro Tour, and while it was awesome to see top-level Magic again, couldn't help but notice that something was a little off.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 14, and then 15, and then the counter is 16, so it goes to 64. Oh no, this is 10, so it is higher than I thought. 7,
25.
15, 25, 33,
40.
41.
So it's
You targeted that, and then this trigger. Sorry, let me rephrase what I'm trying to ask.
I did this to like say this happens, and then I do this. So it's like I said, this, then this.
Okay.
It seems like even the pro players of Magic are having a difficult time just navigating the game's complexity these days. So what happened? Well, you can trace this back to a design shift that Mark Rosewater coined called Evocative Design. So let's discuss Evocative Design, its merits and faults, and how we can better design for meaningful depth and avoid unnecessary complexity.
Distraction makers.
In an article Mark Rosewater wrote in 2020 called The Grand Experiment, Mark Rosewater discussed what he calls evocative design. And this stands in contrast to an earlier blog that he wrote years previously about lenticular design. Lenticular design presents the idea that much of the complexity of Magic the Gathering can be sort of hidden away from newer players, but still be available to more experienced players. In his article about evocative design, Mark says, the idea behind evocative design is that instead of hiding the extra complexity so that the less experienced players can't see it, we put it front and center. It says, this is complicated. It's going to take a while to understand this. It then wraps it in a very resonant flavor. The flavor does two things. One, it gives a big picture for what the complexity is trying to accomplish, and two, it makes it exciting. It's more important that the player be excited about the new thing than understand it. I think it's sort of this embrace of complexity and this idea that in order for you to accurately represent something in the minds of the players, especially if you're collaborating with other intellectual properties that they might know and love, and you're trying to sort of simulate that experience that is going to require some additional complexity, but also you'll get maybe a stronger payoff with the player because they can wrap their head around, oh, I know how this thing works outside of Magic. Let me connect. Maybe it's easier then for me to connect the dots with how it works inside of Magic. So next, we're going to take a look at where evocative design, I think, falls short. And first, we need to wrap our heads around what complexity is and how we think about it when we're designing games. First, we have what's called comprehension complexity. This is basically just how difficult it is for a player to understand what a card or a game piece or whatever it is supposed to do. So this can be complicated by rules text that's difficult to wrap your head around. Or it could just be trying to describe very confusing, unintuitive interactions. Next, we have board complexity. And board complexity means how difficult is it for players to just wrap their head around the game state, just how different things in play affect each other. Things that contribute to this are a lot of things that you need to track, like counters or ability tokens, or an ability that sort of has cascading effects, where if one action takes place, then it leads to another action and leads to another action. And you have to sort of game out all of those different interactions before you can really understand the actual state of the game, before you can make informed decisions about what you would like to do next. And this is the big one that we'll come back to in a little bit. Lastly, we have strategic complexity, and this is the ability for players to understand the possibilities of a card, right? Some of them at surface level might do one thing, but then on further analysis, you might uncover that this card has a lot of different possibilities. And if we come back to our idea of like what is board complexity, we can see a very simple example using the card Prodigal Pyromancer. This basically, the way that this adds additional board complexity is because of its presence on the board. If you were to tap it to deal 1 damage to a creature, it basically means it has to be evaluated in any combat interaction, where if I was to attack with a 2/2 and you had a 3/3 and I had the Prodigal's Pyromancer, I could then trade with your 3/3, and that's one more variable that you would need to wrap your head around before you would understand what it means to block my 2/2. Okay, so let's get back to the Pro Tour and the issue at hand. And really, the board complexity issue is coming to a head, I think, in these instances where we see even the most professional Magic players have a difficult time understanding what is going on the board state before they can get to the meaningful decision. There's a lot of unnecessary math to just figure out what the board state actually is. And most of this is being generated by a few abilities. One is landfall and the other is earthbending. So let's examine a board state to better wrap our heads around how complex this situation actually is. So let's say in play we have a Miteform Harmonizer, a Diadrine Synthesis Amalgam, Badgermole Cub, Earthbender Ascension, Lumbering World Wagon, and 2 forests that have been earthbent. So in order for us to attack, we're going to crew Lumbering World Wagon with the Harmonizer. We're going to attack with the World Wagon, which triggers Diadrine. We're going to remove counters from the Earthbent Forest to get a robot, but the forest will die and return from the graveyard, which will trigger the landfalls of Earthbender's Ascension and Harmonizer twice. So we'll give a +1/+1 counter from the Ascension to the Lumbering World Wagon. We'll do this twice, and then we're going to double the World Wagon's power with Miteform Harmonizer. So if we have 4 lands in play, that means that the wagon was a 4/4, and then a 6/6, then it was a 12/12, and then it was a 24/24. So we are attacking for, we could theoretically in this situation attack for 24 damage. Then once we've done all that analysis to figure out like, okay, well, that's one way that this interaction could go. I could attack for 24 with this creature. Then I need to wrap my head around the fact that what can my opponent do? And if my opponent has a similar board state where they can create a complex interaction, I must go through all of the sort of if-then statements to get to, okay, well, what is my opponent capable of in terms of blocking this creature? Or can they survive this attack and attack back? And how much can they attack back for on their next turn? So much of this design decision is a consequence of parallel play. We talked about parallel versus orthogonal play, which we might change the name of orthogonal to intersecting play, but whatever. And with Magic's continued focus on designing for parallel play, we get a lot of effects that interact with cards on your side of the board. This is a way to create sort of navigational challenges for players without them interacting with their opponents, so that they can be focused on their game state while their opponents might be socializing, and they don't need to necessarily interrupt the conversation to say, hey, I'm doing this to like interact with your creatures, that sort of thing. But in Commander, the consequences of this style of design aren't felt the same way that they are in 1v1 competitive, where in Commander, oftentimes players aren't really concerned with optimization, right? They're just sort of there to have a good time. And if the board state complexity gets too high, they can kind of just sort of say, I don't really think I have enough to attack right now, or I want to wait until I can be sure that I have enough damage to attack to win the game. This is where things like Craterhoof Behemoth come in, where they sort of override the need for you to do this complex board state math to understand if you like can win the game. But when we look at like 1v1 competitive, pro players have to do this math all of the time. The concern is that, well, if you design for 1v1 competitive orthogonal play, casual players can opt out of that experience if they don't like it because they're not concerned with playing optimally. But when you look at 1v1 competitive, these players cannot opt out of these play patterns even if they are poor because they have to play the most optimally. That also goes for the fact that they need to understand this game state complexity before they can make the decisions that they need to make as to whether or not they can win the game. Because if they can't wrap their head around the complex board state and going through all of the different sort of if-then interactions that are possible on the game board, they might miss an attack for lethal damage and end up losing the game. I think the question might arise then as to like why this is even a problem, and that if you want to be the best player at the game, you should be able to do these complex interactions. The problem is that there is a correct answer. It's just difficult to get to that correct answer to then make the meaningful decisions. The goal here is to not obfuscate simple decisions with complex maths, right? We want simple board states that create complex decisions. And I think this is the inverse that has happened here with Magic. When you have these sort of complicated connected mechanics that cascade into different consequences, and you have to game out each one of them to find just the optimal path forward before you're making the decisions that are more about reading your opponent or understanding the different complex ways that individual simple cards can be used to get you through a line of play that ultimately wins you the game. A lot of pro players refer to this as playing to your outs, meaning that you would understand your deck well enough that the situation that you're put in where you're currently sort of potentially losing the game, but you have an out in your deck still. And so you change the way that you're playing so that if you do draw that out, you could then turn the game around for yourself. And I think this is like one of the most important skills that Magic teaches, because it's applicable to like life generally, right? Where you can think about the fact that let me understand the complexity of the situation, understand my sort of line of play in any given circumstance in your life, and then set yourself up so that if something does go wrong, you can effectively play to your outs, and you'll understand how to move out of that situation to like mitigate the potential losses. So underneath all of this board state complexity that was happening at the Pro Tour with particularly these landfall decks, there's actually an interaction that I think is quite good, but it's difficult to get to the interesting part. The card Erode falls under this category of an effect that is quite simple, but it can be used in different ways depending on the game state to give yourself an advantage. Erode can be used sort of offensively to remove a blocker from your opponent so that you can attack through with your creatures. It can be used defensively in that you can remove one of your opponent's attackers, or it can be used in kind of this third way that happens to synergize particularly well with these landfall decks, where you use Erode on one of your own creatures to get yourself a land. And this does have a lot of overlap with the earthbending ability, because you can erode one of your own lands. That land will come back, and you will also get another land from your deck from Erode's effect. And so Erode sits in this really interesting space between it being kind of a defensive spell or an offensive spell, that those sort of intricate interactions are buried under the fact that the board state complexity is very, very high. I think the way that I can best sum this up is for players to be for us as designers to think about this as, I can understand what my cards do easily, but the challenge is in understanding when and how to use them, rather than I can't even understand what my cards are capable of because there's too much math, there's too much crunch, there's too many different variables that I need to account for before I can make a decision about what is actually meaningful. And I think this just brings me back to what Mark Rosewater said about evocative design, that it's more important that players be excited about the thing than understand it. And I feel like that's really my concern here, is that Magic is moving in this direction of, well, we don't really care if players fully understand what's going on in the game as long as they're excited about it. Well, I'm sure that was a very complicated video about complexity. If you have any further questions, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.